Hello there and welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be talking about remote ID, specifically around the new FAA proposals on their new regulations to be enforced in the USA, as well as the incoming laws that are happening in Europe around the EU regs. Now, I've done two other videos on this already, and in this one I want to concentrate specifically on remote ID, how it affects current aircraft owners, whether it be fixed wing, drone or FPV, how it will affect new owners in the future, as well as people like self-builders, because I've received a lot of questions on these subjects. So what I've done, I've put a new slide pack together and I'm going to walk through that in this video and try and clear up some of the questions that I have been asked. Okay, so what we're going to do is take you through a slide pack that I've put together to try and explain how this remote ID will affect any aircraft you currently own, any aircraft you currently purchase or intend to build in the future, whether that be drone, fixed wing plane, helicopter, glider, FPV quad. This stands for everyone in these regulations. Now, the first thing we're going to talk about is the FAA proposals. Now, I will say at this stage they are just proposals and you have 60 days to comment on these before they take it a step further. When we're talking about the EU regs, that is currently in law and will come into force in June 2020. So with regards to the FAA side, there is opportunity to have your say. With regards to the EU side, this is already done and dusted, and I was talking about that in another one of my videos before. Now, looking at the FAA proposals, they have mandated 2 levels of remote ID on any aircraft over 0.55 pounds, which is roughly 250 grams. They are calling this a standard ID and a limited ID, and any aircraft sold will be required to comply with one of these two systems to be able to fly anywhere normal in the USA. They have a hardware limitation requirement within the specification as well, which means if you don't have ID or it's not working, you won't be allowed to take off. And there are also limitations around where you can fly and how far you can fly, depending on if it's a standard ID or a limited ID, which we'll touch on later. They also have strict requirements for serial numbers on the aircraft. And whilst this is the same as in the EU, they have actually taken this quite a step forward compared to them. And this really does have an effect on Model RC, and again we'll touch on that a little bit later. Aircraft that do not comply with the remote ID regulations, whether it is aircraft you are going to buy, you currently own, will be required to have remote ID to be able to fly outside of FAA RIA areas. Now, I'll explain what they are very shortly. However, the basic of this is, if your aircraft does not comply with remote ID, once this law comes into force, you will be limited to flying at very specific locations, as long as your aircraft is over 0.55 pounds. Now, as I said, this is a current proposal and you have 60 days to give your feedback on this, and we'll discuss that at the end. However, there would be a 2-year transition period from this becoming law before it fully comes in. So I would expect this to come into force roughly 3 years from today, and that's the rough ballpark of where this is going to be. Now, something to be aware of with the FAA proposals is there is some fundamental changes on how you will be able to fly your Model RC aircraft, and they will become apparent to you as we move through this presentation, and you will actually see the differences between it and the EU. Talking about the EU requirements, these are very similar in some ways, but are actually fundamentally different in others. They still have a requirement for remote ID, however, it is broadcast ID only, and I'll explain the difference between broadcast and network in the next couple of slides. Again, this is only for aircraft over 250 grams, and it falls in with aircraft that, depending on what class requirement they fall into, because within the EU, they've mandated various levels of class of craft depending on weight, and where you're able to fly with those craft depending on the weight. Now, they have got serial number requirements just like the FAA, however they don't quite have the same impact on hobby users as the FAA proposals, and you will be still able to fly your hobby, your made, your self-built aircraft even after these regs come into place within the EU, unlike the US proposal. Now, the law comes into force from June 2020, and again there is a a 2-year transitionary period in this. One nice bit we'll talk about a lot later is the retrofit opportunity in the compliance for the EU. They have allowed users to be able to have bolt-on accessories for it to be able to comply with the drone ID requirements. So if you did have an aircraft where you wanted to be able to fly it where the drone ID is necessary, you would have the option, once hardware becomes available, to make your aircraft compliant, and we'll touch on that shortly. Now, the initial differences between these two proposals really is one has a requirement for network ID and broadcast ID, and the other has just broadcast. But there are fundamental differences in where the two regulations will actually allow you to fly when you don't comply. And in the FAA proposal, these are called Recognized Identification Areas. Now, the basics of this are as the text shows on the screen, because this is a direct take from the FAA proposal. What they are saying is this: any aircraft that does not comply with the remote ID requirements once or if this became law would only be allowed to fly in recognized identification areas. Now, they estimate approximately 90% of AMA fields would become one of these areas. However, there are some fundamentally dodgy things around the way they've proposed this, and one of them is that they are only going to allow application for these areas for the first 12 months. After that, there will never be any further application for RIA areas, and from that point forward, they will only ever be reduced. And what that means is the limited areas that you will be able to fly out with a non-compliant aircraft will get smaller and smaller as time goes on. It will also mean you'll only be able to fly at these places if they let you, and many clubs and organizations don't necessarily cater for every kind of aircraft flyer that is out there, especially FPV and drone users, because over the years we found we haven't always been embraced by the Model RC community, and there is a very real concern that many self-build FPV users, hobby users, will have nowhere to fly if these proposals come into force. So the basics of this bit is, unless the aircraft complies with the remote ID standard, you will only be able to fly in recognized identification areas by the FAA. Now, this is only in their proposal. In the EU, things are actually very, very different. The next thing I want to do quickly is explain the difference between the two remote ID systems, whether it be network or broadcast. Now, broadcast ID is simply transmitting the required data locally from the aircraft over wireless radio, whether this be Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, or some other standard. Now, it will transmit the data that they've mandated in the law, which is things like GPS location of the aircraft, the ground station or pilot, the GPS speed of the aircraft, the altitude, serial number, and remote ID name. And the idea is this system will allow anyone with a standard smart device, such as a phone or tablet with the correct app, to be able to look at a drone in the sky, open the app, and identify who it is, where it is, and who is flying it. Now, this is very similar to DJI Remote ID, which they use with their Aeroscope systems currently, but the only real difference is that it is an open standard for anyone to be able to receive and not a closed one. Because this is using wireless radio, it is fairly simple to implement. Usually these systems piggyback this data off the back of your control link, so not much additional hardware, if any, is needed, and it really can be introduced simply via a firmware update. So from a technical standpoint, it really is fairly simple to comply with. Network ID, on the other hand, is a far more complex animal, and this will require you to connect either your aircraft system or smart device to an internet-based provider, what they call a UTM or a USS provider, and they will then collect all that information from all the pilots around the world and then give that to the government and the FAA. Now, this system is in the mandate for the FAA proposals as well, whereas it is not in the EU law requirements. So this is something new and is only being recommended in the US at the moment. Now, the way this will work is either your aircraft will have a SIM card on board, which you will have to pay a data connection for, and it will connect directly to the internet and transmit this data, or your remote controller will do that, or your remote will connect to your smart device, transmit that data back. Now, the issue with this is that it will require you to have a available Wi-Fi or data data connection at all times. And the FAA have mandated within the ID requirements that you will have to have this working before you can fly. Now, there are some quirks around that as well, which I won't go too deeply into right now, but the reality is for a standard ID, you will be required to have both broadcast and network, and a limited ID, you must have just network. Now, with a standard ID aircraft, you will actually be able to fly if the network isn't working, whereas on a limited ID, you won't be able to fly and you will be required to have this connection at all times. Now, as I've said, there are going to be costs involved for this because A, you are going to have to pay for your data connection, B, you're going to have to provide money for the UTM provider to be able to give you their service. Now, the FAA have said there's going to be up to 9 providers in total, and the users will be able to choose which one best suits them. But the reality is there is going to be additional cost levied on pilots with this system because you will be able to comply. Now, because this system is internet and cloud-based, that means all data from around the country will be fed into one system, and government, police and agencies will be able to see the location of every drone with this system flying at all times. Because it is all being fed in, they also have a requirement to keep hold of your data as well, and the FAA have said that they require the data to be held for no more or less than 6 months. So that means all of your data and flights will be held centrally on file for 6 months with this system, and that is something to be aware of. Now, cost-wise, obviously the data connection is going to be down to you to provide. However, they are estimating the UTM costs to be anywhere between $3 and $5 a month. Now, whether that is per aircraft or not is another question. However, the chances are they're estimating around $2.50 to $5 to be able to connect to one of these systems. So whereas the initial broadcast ID system simply sends it out via the wireless system with no additional hardware really needed, the remote ID network system is a much more complex animal, and the reality is the chances are the way this will work is that your aircraft will connect to your remote controller with your smart device will then connect to the internet, your app will then log you on to this USS UTM provider, you will have an ID and it will synchronize, and you'll have to stay connected to that at all times before you can fly. Now, there is a whole host of complexity around this which I haven't gone into that they've put in, like requirements for you to actually have to be online before you can fly, the ability for you to not get around it, but there also are some bypasses as well, as I hinted to earlier. Now, looking at the both sets of regulations side by side, the basics are within the EU, they require a broadcast ID only on craft transmitting data such as this location and everything I talked about for aircraft that comply with remote ID. If you comply, you will get more permissions within the UK than you get today. So for instance, currently a user is not allowed to fly within 50 meters of a building they don't control or people, and not in a congested area. However, with this system, you will have the ability to fly, depending on the aircraft size, within a congested area and down to as close as 5 meters of people, depending on the aircraft side, even over the top of them in certain circumstances. For aircraft that don't comply in the EU, you basically are restricted to flying in areas away from people and not congested. So the reality is, within the EU regulations, not a lot changes for general users. Whilst things are different for commercial operators, for standard users, you can't fly in congested now and you can't fly close to people. And if you have an aircraft that doesn't comply, nothing will change. But if you do comply, you will actually get more privileges. Moving over to the FAA side, things are fundamentally different. All aircraft will be required to comply with either the standard ID or limited ID, so aircraft must be sold with one or the other. Standard ID requires the aircraft broadcast both a broadcast ID and a network ID. The broadcast ID must work at all times. The network ID must connect automatically. And if there is a problem with the UTM provider, it must be able to jump onto another one. Now, there is a little bit of a get out in the standard ID that says if you are somewhere where there is no coverage, it will allow flight when there is no network ID. However, if you're not registered with a UTM or USS provider, it won't allow flight. So it isn't correct to say within the standard ID that you can't fly without a network ID connection, because it's not quite the case, but there are some very specific get outs on that, such as if a connection isn't available, you will be allowed to fly, but it isn't the norm as the way they've interpreted and worded it. Now, with regards to the limited ID, this must have the network aspect only. The aircraft must not transmit data locally, and it must simply transmit from, say, the ground station itself. Now, it must connect at all times, but one of the interesting bits to that class with the limited ID is that it must have a physical limitation of 400 foot from the ground station at all times. So reality is, whilst the standard ID has more complexity, it has more freedom compared to the limited ID as well. Now, what aircraft will have what and the other? The reality is most consumer off-the-shelf drones will have standard ID, because implementing the network ID isn't that difficult from a smart device point of view, with a phone already being used as your screen. However, for Model RC aircraft, the chances are a lot of fixed wing off-the-shelf aircraft and helicopters will end up with the limited ID, because many of these don't have the complex flight controllers with GPS and things like that. So there are some differences between the two systems, and if you're a self-builder, things are very, very different, and we'll come on to that towards the end. With regards to the EU proposals, as I've said, they actually give you more permissions. If you look at a Mavic style craft, sub 900 grams, you'd be allowed to fly in a congested area as close as not directly over people, but there's no minimum distance. On a C2 class craft, you'd be able to fly no closer than 30 meters horizontally on something like an Inspire 2, or even as close as 5 meters if it's got a low speed mode, such as tripod mode. So there are much more benefits in the EU system, but the interesting point is, if your craft doesn't comply, you simply cannot fly in congested and not close to people. If we look at the FAA side though, things are fundamentally different. Standard ID craft can basically fly as you are today, as long as the ID system is fully working and you have both network ID and the broadcast ID, although you can fly if the network ID isn't working. Limited ID aircraft, so these are ones that don't transmit directly but only use the network aspect, can fly anywhere currently, however, physically limited to 400 foot from the ground station in software. So again, there are limitations even on the limited ID side, and one of the big ones is it will not take off without network ID working, whereas the standard ID actually will in some circumstances. So how does this affect you as a current owner? Well, the reality is within the EU, all types of model aircraft are affected in both the EU and the FAA proposals. Current owners in the EU will be given 2 years to comply, but for ones that don't comply will simply be limited to flying away from congested areas and not close to people, as I've already said a number of times. Within the FAA proposals, you will again have 2 years to comply. However, if your aircraft doesn't comply, you will only be able to fly at one of the FAA RIAs, period. That is not up for negotiation. So your aircraft that can't be made to comply will be limited to a specific area to fly, and as I've said, they propose about 90% of AMA sites at the moment. So whereas in the EU, if you don't comply, there isn't a lot of change, within the USA, it is entirely different. Now, something I will say on this is most off-the-shelf drones should be able to comply with most systems. Even many of the drones sold today with the FAA proposals should be able to comply with the limited ID at minimum. Most of them, with a software update and a new app, should be able to get the full standard ID. However, that's if the FAA authorize it, because they have to certify everything. So it really isn't just as simple as the manufacturer adding a software update, because they have to conform to all of the FAA compliance, put conformity documentation in and allow them to inspect the aircraft for it. With regards to Model RC stroke fixed wing glider FPV owners in the FAA proposals in the USA, things are not good, and there's no other way of putting that. The reality is there is basically no way for your aircraft to be compliant, and I'll explain why a little bit later in the video. However, the reality is there is no onboard flight controllers, there's no simple way of adding remote ID to these devices, and unless something fundamentally changes, you are going to be heavily limited on where you can fly to those FAA-recognized identification areas. Now, you might be asking, well, why can't there be a third-party app, or why can't there be a retrofit box that allows me to comply? The way the FAA proposals are set out, they basically make that close to impossible because of the craft requiring certification, because it requiring checks and fully complying with the ID standards. Even if you could have an app that allowed you to connect to the network ID element to be able to get your aircraft to comply with the serial number requirements, the FAA requirements would be massively costly and close to impossible to retrofit. However, when you flip the coin and look at the EU proposals, the reality is most people won't even need to comply with standard Model RC as long as they're not flying in congested and close to people. However, if they did want to comply, the EU have specifically talked about allowing third-party manufacturers to make hardware to allow aircraft to be able to comply. So whereas in the USA proposals with the FAA, it's basically not possible, EU have taken a very different stance, and they're going to allow you to add hardware if you want to, and as long as it's compliant, you should be able to get the benefits that will come with that. Now, one of the big questions I received when I did my last two videos was, where do I stand if I build my own model aircraft, build my own drones, FPV quads? Well, this is basically the same as any other aircraft. There is some complexity with the FAA proposals around who is responsible, depending on if you've bought it as a kit, if you've made it yourself, but the outcome is the same. It only changes who is responsible for ensuring compliance. So FPV, self-build, they all are required to comply. If they do not comply, you are again limited to the FAA areas. You will not be able to fly anywhere. As I've said, you won't be able to retrofit, as I see it in the FAA proposals, very easily, and as it stands today, all FPV and self-build drones will be limited to only flying in FAA approved areas. And that is a massive difference compared to the EU proposals. And in the EU proposals, it's the same as a craft that doesn't comply. You basically won't be able to fly in congested, but there is no requirement to specifically limit where you can fly. You've just got to stay away from people and stay away from congested areas overall. So where do we stand with future products on this? Well, the reality is RTF drones off the shelf really won't have any problems complying with these, whether it be the EU or the USA requirements. From a technical standpoint, none of this is particularly difficult. From the broadcast ID, we're basically doing it today with DJI Remote ID. With regards to network ID, that is a fairly simple thing to be able to integrate into these models that already use apps, that already have these complex systems in place. However, it is fundamentally different for Model RC. They will have to completely change what hardware they have on board, and even to be able to comply with the limited ID aspect, they are going to need flight control systems, they are going to need software to prevent flight should those systems not be working. Now, it is possible that could all be done in the RC side of things, in the control link. However, it's too early days to say that for sure. Within the USA, pretty much it closes down most traditional Model RC and limits them to flying at those FAA sites only. For the EU, pretty much nothing changes, and as long as you're not flying near people, business as usual. Now, as I touched on in that last slide, I do think the remote controller area is somewhere we could see some development, because having read the regulations a number of times, I do think there's an opportunity for the RC to be able to comply with the limited ID aspect specifically. However, this is not going to be easy and is certainly not going to be cheap. Now, before any hardware will be allowed to be sold or pass the remote ID standard, it will have to pass the FAA requirements, as well as having a declaration of compliance. And this is what is going to prevent hobby users from getting involved in this, because hobby users, even if they could physically make their aircraft comply, they would have to send declaration of compliance to the FAA. The FAA will have to certify your aircraft before they will allow it to go on the register, because every type of aircraft that is allowed will be on a register of certified models. However, that's to say manufacturers of remotes can't get involved. I do think the likes of Philip Rose from Hurlink, who've already said they're going to try and do something. He owns Profi CNC, makes Hurlink, the Cube Autopilot. He's already out and out said he's going to get involved. You've got some of the smart radios from Futaba and Spectrum, that some of these are Android based, so there would be the opportunity to get some compliance through those models as well. And also don't forget DJI with their FPV system, because they have all of their expertise from their ready to fly models. They should be able to come up with a solution for the FPV community one way or another. However, none of this is going to be cheap, none of this is going to be easy, and the reality is the chances are it will mean new hardware for a lot of users, and whether you'll even still be able to have one RC to control multiple aircraft is another question as well, because of the way they've set up the serial number requirements. However, it's very early days on this side of it, and it's very difficult to say either way how this will end up, but my money is on the RC side of things being an area where some compliance could happen. But again, it is all these certifications that prevent hobby users getting involved, because it really isn't as simple as just saying my hardware works. You need to be able to certify it with the FAA as well. Now, that is obviously for the network ID aspect. For the broadcast ID, I know there will be hardware. You're going to see that for the EU region. However, that isn't going to be easy for the FAA region, because again, they have strict requirements on how that hardware integrates into the aircraft and how its fail-safe systems work as well. And again, it's just not going to be that simple. But if anyone can do it, you're going to see the likes of Ardra Pilot get involved, PX4 and others like that. But again, it's going to take some time. So what can you do? Well, the EU regulations are already in law, and the reality is there is nothing too scary in them right now. Whilst I don't personally like my aircraft transmitting my location, it is what it is, and we have to accept it because it's now in law. However, the FAA situation is simply proposals at this time, and you have until the 2nd of the 3rd, 2020 to give them your feedback. I strongly suggest every single person does who watches this video, but if you do it, please do be clear, concise, keep it clean and constructive, avoid any swearing, because you don't want to give them an excuse to disregard your comments, because they will take anything that they think is nonsense and throw it in the bin. Give them your story about how you got involved with Model RC and make a difference, and make them see how important this is to you. Base any feedback on the fundamental principles, things like the restricted areas, because the reality is the remote ID is going to happen. The network requirements, hit them on that one, but don't say we don't want network ID, because again, I honestly think that's ending up going to happen. It's about taking some bricks out of the wall so the whole thing falls down, and not concentrate on the little stuff that they can simply say we've already addressed that here, or we've already addressed that there, because they will do that with certain things, especially if you say something like I don't want remote ID. They'll simply say, well, we've already addressed why we're doing that. So but concentrate on the areas that are massively restrictive and underpin some of the further regulation that sits on top of it. That is it for this video. It will probably be my last one on the remote ID side of things unless something changes. I honestly hope it's been helpful and I've explained it and I haven't got anything wrong. I probably have. It is a complex subject. I'm certainly no expert on this stuff, but I do try to put out correct information. If you've liked what you've seen, please do subscribe to the channel. Make sure you feedback on these proposals and I will do another video again soon.